I mentioned in my previous video that Banjo-Kazooie boasted a deceptively elegant and well-designed camera system. Banjo-Tooie actually manages to improve even further upon that system with a few minor but meaningful tweaks. First of all, camera rotation is no longer limited to the discrete but interruptible camera swings from Kazooie. Instead, holding the left or right C buttons causes the camera to rotate around Banjo and Kazooie until the button is released. The speed of the rotation is slower than the camera swings from Kazooie, making it easier to more precisely position the camera by timing the button's release. In a clever touch, a quick tap of the C button rotates the camera in a similar increment to that seen in Banjo-Kazooie, giving a familiar feel to the camera controls for those who are used to the first game. Tooie also makes a change to the reactive camera positioning. In short, the speed of the camera movements have been reduced. Intuitively, it seems that a slower camera might be a negative change, but this ends up benefiting the game in a very subtle way. Specifically, quick changes in the player's direction of movement result in far smoother camera pans. In Banjo-Kazooie, we can see the camera jumping back and forth quite quickly upon turning, which can be somewhat jarring if multiple turns are done in sequence. In Banjo-Tooie, the camera's slower movement makes the repositioning much less jerky and disorienting. This change runs the slight risk of reducing the player's awareness of obstacles in their new movement direction, but overall, this is a welcome addition that eliminates one of the very few complaints I had about Banjo-Kazooie's camera. Another interesting change is the complete lack of fixed camera segments aside from a few boss battles. Although there aren't many sections that would be improved by a fixed camera perspective, this change does bring about my only complaint about the camera system. Occasionally, when moving along a ledge, enemies lurking in the walls might be out of frame. This seems like an issue that could easily have been resolved by fixing the camera in a way that keeps these enemies in view. This is a minor complaint at best, however, and one that's just as easily resolved by paying closer attention to one's surroundings. Visually speaking, Banjo-Tooie has an overall aesthetic quite similar to Banjo-Kazooie's, but includes a number of graphical improvements. Most notably, there's a sizable increase in the diversity of textures and environments. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise, as the game's cartridge had double the capacity of its predecessors, but it's nice to see regardless. Also noteworthy are the improvements in animation, which feature increased detail and utility. Kazooie's attacks now cartoonishly enlarge her head for emphasis, and the bouncing flap and swaying movements of Banjo's backpack more effectively convey the fact that it isn't permanently attached to him. Environmental animations are also improved. In Banjo-Kazooie, large bodies of water, such as the ocean in Treasure Trove Cove, were animated through the very slight raising and lowering of the water level, giving the impression of light waves against the shore. Floating objects bobbed and swayed, and a slowly moving texture was drawn on the surface. This is a decent attempt to create the illusion of a fluid, moving ocean, but the surface itself clearly remains flat. In Banjo-Tooie, however, most large bodies of water are now fully and physically animated, with gentle waves in oceans, pools, and ponds. Visual effects are even present underwater, as the viewport slowly distorts and skews back and forth. The surface waves in particular represent a surprisingly sophisticated form of environmental animation for the N64. Although this kind of animation is fairly simple to create using a vertex shader, the N64 was unable to use shaders. Rareware was renowned for their ability to work around the limitations of the console, however, often making use of lower-level graphics functions, and even writing their own microcode in assembly. Considering how infamously difficult the N64 was to work with, the effort put in to create even minor touches like these is extremely impressive. As far as technical achievements go, however, Banjo-Tooie's most impressive feature is its lighting system. Banjo-Kazooie primarily used simple ambient lighting throughout the game. This means all of the terrain in a level is lit evenly, with any shading generally being a part of the texture on a given object. Large terrain and certain other objects cast static, directional shadows, with Banjo and Kazooie having a simple circular shadow directly beneath them, which changes size depending on their distance from the ground. When Banjo and Kazooie step into the shadows cast by other objects, the brightness of the ambient lighting on their character model is lowered. This causes the model to appear darker, as if it were actually obscured from a light source. We can observe this when the player is stepping into or out of a shadow. Because ambient lighting applies to an entire object evenly, the entire character model changes brightness, even if some portion is still within the shadow. This is actually a very effective and efficient way to create the illusion of more dynamic lighting, and it's practically unnoticeable unless viewing footage frame by frame. Banjo-Tooie also makes use of this trick, but its lighting system as a whole is far more advanced. The game makes extensive use of point light sources, especially in darker areas such as the caves in Glitter Gulch Mine. We can see that Banjo and Kazooie are now shaded dynamically in the presence of these light sources, and their models even reflect lighting effects like the flickering of a torch. This kind of lighting looks fantastic, and perhaps even more impressive is the addition of dynamic shadows for Banjo, Kazooie, Mumbo, and all of Banjo's transformations. Instead of a simple circular shadow beneath the player, the shadow is generated on the fly based on the current lighting in the room. If no point light sources are present, the shadow defaults to a constant directional light source directly above the player. This is actually an important consideration for platforming, as the shadow conveys where the player is going to land. However, in the presence of a jiggy or certain environmental lights, the shadow skews wildly and is even cast multiple times if there are multiple light sources. Note how the shadow rotates around Banjo in time with the jiggy circling around him as it's collected. It may not seem like much, but it's worth stressing how technically impressive it is to see this kind of real-time lighting in an N64 game. Allowing the player to create multiple point light sources in the form of the fire eggs is yet another great addition. Although the fire eggs don't see much use in general, their ability to partially illuminate dark areas provides an alternate collection method for at least 2 jiggies. This is a great way to reward a player's ingenuity and powers of observation. Banjo-Tooie's draw distance is just as impressive as its predecessors, but its expansive open levels can sometimes be a bit too ambitious for the N64 hardware, and there are several locations where the frame rate drops considerably. The addition of a native 16:9 widescreen mode is yet another impressive technical achievement, even if it does impact the frame rate even more heavily. Even with these slowdowns, however, Banjo-Tooie's graphics are deserving of fairly high praise. Ultimately, when it comes to visuals, if Banjo-Kazooie's graphics could be considered impressive for the time, then Tooie's are a technical marvel, and easily among the best on the Nintendo 64. By far the biggest appeal of Banjo-Kazooie, and my largest point of praise for the game, was the manner in which its movement and level design worked in tandem with one another. Multiple movement paces, and the fact that there was rarely a need to stop and wait or worry about instant death traps made the experience very fluid and accessible. Banjo-Tooie follows a somewhat similar design pattern, but mixes things up in a few interesting ways. For the most part, Tooie's levels retain a focus on fluid, quick-paced movement and platforming with minimal waiting, and most of the changes in the core gameplay, as mentioned earlier, are centered around streamlining and speeding things up. The most notable change, aside from those I've already mentioned, is the complete removal of the lives system. As the game also removes its predecessor's main punishment for death by making the collection of notes permanent, Banjo-Tooie effectively removes all of the stakes for player death that were established in Kazooie. However, I think this was definitely the right choice. The lives system in general is a completely needless throwback whenever there aren't any mechanics to complement it. In most platformers, progression is linear, often with a series of checkpoints. Simply undoing these checkpoints when the player runs out of lives serves as an effective way to establish stakes for failure. Banjo-Tooie has no such complementary mechanic, however, and I'm not sure that it's possible to make one that wouldn't simply be frustrating and tedious. However, this does lead to an odd situation owing to Tooie's complex level design and the fact that dying brings the current character back to the point at which they entered the level. Simply put, sometimes the fastest and most convenient way to travel through a level is to die. With this lack of consequences, most players who realize this won't hesitate to jump into a bottomless pit or run into an enemy until they're dead. In some cases, death can even be used as a quick way to refill the player's health. In addition, the game saves each time a jiggy is collected, so any tension is all but erased as soon as the player collects one, regardless as to their surroundings. As a point of interest, the current 100% speedrun route for Banjo-Tooie features 35 intentional deaths used to save time. I don't necessarily feel that Tooie is a lesser game because of these choices, it just feels strange that the mechanic of player death seems to be more beneficial than harmful in the long run. It may have been a better idea to require collectibles to be brought to a specific point in a level, such as the warp pads, before their collection would be saved, although this again runs the risk of making things frustrating, for instance if a player dies to an unrelated hazard after collecting a difficult jiggy. The relative lack of consequences for death makes for an interesting, if unintentional, quirk to the game's overall playstyle, but it also has implications on the game's level design by giving the developers more freedom to increase the difficulty. More than half of Tooie's levels feature bottomless pits or other comparably harsh hazards, compared to just 2 in Kazooie. Every main level also features a boss battle, and while some of these are better than others, I can appreciate the effort required to make them work. This is especially true considering that all of Tooie's bosses are unique characters. They almost always require something other than brute force, rather than simply being giant or more powerful versions of regular enemies, a trope that all but 2 of the former game's bosses fit into. On the whole, Tooie's levels certainly seem more difficult than Kazooie's, which feels like another logical move for a direct sequel to make. One of the more interesting design trends in Banjo-Tooie is its tendency toward disjointed and temporarily transferred control of various characters. This is illustrated in the very first level, when the player assumes control of Mumbo, who himself assumes control of a giant golden statue. It's more notably used in what could be considered Tooie's flagship technique, splitting up Banjo and Kazooie. On its face, this might seem like a strange idea, as one of the main draws of Banjo-Kazooie was the concept of the two working as a team. However, separating them introduces a surprising amount of new depth to the gameplay. This is largely because of the huge differences in the way the two characters control. Kazooie is incredibly agile and mobile. She's able to cover enormous lateral distances, descend from heights without the risk of damage, and later in the game, the combination of a solo backflip and a gliding technique means that there are few, if any, areas that are truly out of reach for her. This high mobility comes at a cost, however, as Kazooie learns very few solo techniques aside from those used for movement, and she lacks the ability to swim or climb ledges and vines. Banjo, on the other hand, has much more limited movement options on the ground. Even with an unintended double jump exploit by using Banjo's attack in mid-air, Banjo's slower movement speed and delayed attack animation can make getting from place to place slightly more challenging. However, the number of moves that Banjo learns on his own is surprisingly extensive. His techniques, centered around his now empty backpack, make him a fairly versatile problem solver. These two characters on their own make for very different gameplay experiences, and I appreciate the fact that splitting them up introduces both unique strengths and unique weaknesses that are logically tied to the fact that they're no longer together. Cloud Cuckoo Land in particular makes extensive use of the split-up mechanic, requiring the use of Banjo, Kazooie, and Mumbo in tandem to fully complete the level. Although the level is somewhat confusingly laid out, this cooperative aspect of its design stands out as a strong point, tying a lot of learned concepts together to make for an interesting challenge. From both a gameplay and storytelling perspective, the split-up mechanic illustrates that while the game's protagonists are strongest when they're together, the duo are still more than capable on their own. I do have one issue with it, however, which is Jamjar's refusal to teach solo moves if the pair happen to be together. There's really no reason to enforce this limitation that I can see, and since there's no indication as to which silos teach solo moves, this often results in wasted time spent backtracking and searching for a split-up pad. The fact that split-up pads are required at all also seems a bit limiting, but I can understand the need for it from a design perspective. If it were possible to switch to solo Kazooie at any time, the entire game would essentially need to be redesigned to account for the player's increased mobility. Banjo-Tooie arguably already creates a need in that regard with the introduction of Clockwork Kazooie eggs, another prime example of temporarily transferred control. The Clockwork Kazooie eggs launch a wind-up remote control bomb with a limited timer. The most interesting aspect of this new move is the fact that Clockwork Kazooies are able to collect items just as any other playable character can. At first, this may seem like a minor point, but an important consideration is the eggs themselves. When fired, the eggs are simple billboarded 2D sprites, with a hitbox much smaller than the size of the egg itself. This means that with precise aiming, it's possible to fire these eggs into small gaps to access areas that would normally be off limits. Add the fact that these eggs can be used to collect objects, and it becomes possible to accomplish a great deal via completely unintended means. Some of these methods are much less suspect than others, and it certainly seems likely that Clockwork Kazooie eggs were meant to facilitate alternate intended collection methods as well. Regardless, even if they occasionally introduce significant unintentional shortcuts, Clockwork Kazooie eggs are a fantastic addition to the game. Due to the fact that they have a limited range and are the only eggs affected by gravity when fired forward, using them properly requires a little more skill, and it's highly satisfying to land a shot just right. They represent a slight paradigm shift in the gameplay that I think few players expected going into Banjo-Tooie, but are designed well enough such that most players are able to understand and explore the new concept almost instantly. The fact that it rewards the player for their ingenuity when it's used to sequence break is just another example of the game's more complex and open-ended design working in its favor. Considering that it would have been fairly trivial to ensure through programming or design that only specific objects could be collected by Clockwork Kazooies, the decision to not follow through on that possibility is commendable.